For 12 years, I was the minister of, uh, an associate minister of the Steamboat, of the Southwest Central Church of Christ in Houston. And doing youth ministry and evangelism and worship leadership. And at the end of every summer, or toward the end of every summer, we would take a Bible retreat that I would lead. And I would spend all year getting ready for this. I would spend all year writing my lessons for this retreat and thinking and praying about what I wanted to do with this group, because fully a third of the congregation would come on this retreat. It would be about half teenagers and half adults. And we would drive 1,000 miles from Houston to come to a place near Colorado Springs, a camp that was called Rockcliffe, that was owned by Friends University. And there we would engage in 8 hours a day of study, worship, and prayer. And it was intense. It was very serious study, worship, and prayer. I made it a point to make the lessons just as hands-on as I could make them and as memorable as I could make them. And I believe it was in the year that we were studying the general epistles, and we studied James and 1st and 2nd Peter and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John and Jude, and then added Philemon for good measure into that mix. And one of the themes for the week was just talking about we talked about a number of social issues, and economic inequality was one of the issues that we talked about. And for instance, in this week, one morning, we played a fairly sophisticated game about the world economy, where we divided everyone up into different countries, and there were 8 or 10 countries represented in the game. And the rules of the game was they had 10 minutes to figure out in each period, which was a month, how they were going to feed their people. And so that we would have they would have an allowance, and they had, we knew how many people they had and how much it was going to cost them, and they had to figure that out and negotiate and work. And then there were things that were thrown in, like there might be a drought, or there might be a bumper crop, or there might be a war, there might be different things, different factors that would come in that would alter the economy, things they had to work out with. And if it ever turned out that a country couldn't feed its people, then they had to decide who on their team they were going to kill and put them out of the game. And we'd let that go on for a couple of hours, and then talk through it. Well, one of the things we did that week was, every night at dinner time, we would ring the bell. Everyone would come and line up for dinner. We would have grace together, and then they would go through and serve themselves buffet style, going through the kitchen, coming out into the dining area. But on this occasion, we set this up differently. We had everyone come in and line up, and I waited till absolutely everyone was there before we stopped and said grace. But instead of then going through the kitchen to serve everyone, I went and I took the last 8 people in line. I took them into the lodge where we had everything set up. And the table for those 8 people had a very nice linen tablecloth on it, fine china, silver flatware, silver cruet set, candelabra, table decorations, fine linen. And those people were served with a steak dinner with steak with garlic, Parmesan bechamel, sauteed mushrooms, new potatoes with rosemary and butter sauce, steamed vegetable medley, fresh croissants, sparkling cider and stemware to drink, and tiramisu for dessert. Then the next 24 last people in line went and set them at 3 tables of 8 each. Those people were served at these tables. They had no tablecloth, no linens. They were served on Melmac dishes, mismatched stainless steel flatware, paper napkins. They were served meatloaf, tossed salad, mashed potatoes, green beans, brown and served rolls, iced tea in anchorware glass to drink, apple pie for dessert. And then the 45 remaining people were brought in, and they were seated on the floor and given wooden bowls and wooden spoons, and they were served rice and water. And at no point did I say, just kidding, everyone gets steak. No. And I didn't tell them what was going on, and I didn't give them any instructions. I just said, this is dinner. Well, immediately, there were 2 junior high boys at the fine dining table, and there were 2 elderly women sitting on the floor being served rice. And they got up immediately and said, come take our place. Come be seated at our table. And they sat on the floor in their place. And then after a couple of minutes, some people from the rice section of the room started getting up and just coming over and asking, can I have a little of this, a little of that? And then people started getting up and taking food from their own table and sharing it among others. And by the time the dinner time was over, everyone had eaten a nice meal and was satisfied. And then we cleaned up. And we spent the evening then, our evening lesson, talking about that. Talking about, well, what had just happened? And what did it mean? Well, one of the first issues that came up was, well, we thought it was really unfair. And I said, you're right. It was. It was really unfair. That's because life is really unfair. And life in the kingdom of God is inherently unequal. And then I directed everyone to Matthew 25, 14 through 30, where we have the parable of the talents. For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each, according to his ability. Now here I just want to point out that the servants don't start out in this parable equal. They weren't equal before the parable even started. They were already unequal because they had differences in ability. They had different strengths. And those differences were before the test. They were before any talents were given out. Which, by the way, prior to the Bible being translated into English and being broadly distributed, prior to the Gutenberg Bible and then to the King James Version, the English word talent always just meant money. Everyone knew that this was an ancient unit of money. The idea of talents as gifts is an invention of clever preachers. That definition of the word talent came from the pulpit. That the word never meant that prior to this Bible verse. But then he gives them this money, and he gives it to them in unequal amounts. And he gives it to them according to their prior condition, which is unequal. And so he magnifies their inequality. And the magnification is enormous. When we talk about how much money is involved here, you think, well, it's 5 talents. Well, indeed, there was a coin that people commonly referred to it as a talent. But in general commerce, strictly speaking, a talent was a gold ingot. It was equal to it's about 200 pounds, a big gold ingot, equal to 2 or 3 good delivery bars of gold in our modern economy. And so it was worth millions of dollars. And so what he was giving these servants was not a small amount of money. And think about this when you think about the wise men coming to visit Jesus. They brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Well, it wasn't a little bag with 10 coins in it or 10 chocolate coins in it. It was gold. It was enough money to finance the royal family's sojourn into Egypt and to pay for Mary to live after Joseph died. So it was a significant amount of money that the wise men brought with them in gold. Well, these servants get these talents, and it's unequal amounts. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now, after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents, and here I've made 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also who had the 2 talents came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also who had received the 1 talent came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. Now, before we go any further, I want to examine what this 1 talent servant has said to the master. Because most of the sermons I heard on this text growing up indicated that what we have here is a dichotomy between faith and fear. This servant is afraid. His master gives him 1 talent, and he's afraid he's going to lose it. And so out of fear, he just buries it. And then he goes, when his master comes back home, he goes and digs it up, takes it back to him. Well, that's not exactly what happened. You see, the servant who has 1 talent, he's not afraid of his master. And when he says he's afraid, he's lying. He hates his master. He doesn't think his master came by his money honestly. He says, You're a hard man. You reap where you haven't sown. What does that mean? You're a thief. You're an awful person. And I was afraid of you, not because I would have failed, but because you would have punished me. Because you're a bad person. This servant hates the master. He's resentful of him, and he's resentful of him because he's rich. He hates the master because the master has money, and the servant assumes that he must have come by it dishonestly. Now, how many times have you heard that? How many times have you heard people who don't have money, who assume that the people who do don't really deserve to have it? They didn't earn it. They didn't come by it honestly. They didn't work for it. They got it by dishonest means. Now, maybe they got it by inheriting it. That's not a dishonest means, but people might accuse you of not having earned your money if you came by it by inheritance. It's still the same accusation. It's a petty hatred. It's a petty suspicion. The one-talent servant isn't just without ability. He's petty. And he doesn't want his master to earn any profit because he doesn't think his master deserves it. And he says, so I was afraid. Well, if you get from that, I was afraid that I would fail, that's not what he's saying. If that's what he's saying, he's lying. Because what he's afraid of is the master's wrath, because he doesn't trust the man. He doesn't like him. He doesn't have a high opinion of him. He thinks that he should perish and his money should perish with him. His master said to him, so I was afraid and I went and hid your talents in the ground. Here, you have what is yours. But his master answered him, you wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown and gathered where I have scattered no seed. Then even still, you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming, I should have received what was my own plus interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. Beloved, the kingdom of God is not the great equalizer. We don't come into the kingdom equal. We don't stay equal in the kingdom. And what is it that Jesus says we're doing while we're here on earth? We don't earn our salvation, but you better believe we earn our treasures in heaven. Those are our rewards for our good deeds. Those good deeds aren't worth less. They're worthless toward salvation, but they're not worthless toward the kingdom of God. Post-salvation, the kingdom of God is a pure meritocracy. Those treasures in heaven that you're going to receive, those are because of your good works. There's no time in which we will be equal in the kingdom of heaven. Now, when you start saying that, people point to the parable of the workers who worked all day. Well, don't miss the point of that. The point of that is that the pay of those workers who came at different times of day was equal, and that was unfair. That was inequality according to their work. And at the end of that parable, the master says, it's my money. I'll do with it as I please. You know, who are you telling me what to do with my riches? And so, as we process what had happened in this meal and the circumstances with which these people were met, which, by the way, if you later tell anyone about this or decide to try something like this, think very carefully. This requires a great deal of trust from the people that you're working with. I had an intern who took this idea away from that year and tried to implement it in his own congregation at some time years later, and it backfired terribly. And he was not equipped to deal with the questions that came up. And he had a terrible experience with this same lesson. So just so you know, I took a high risk in doing this. It worked out well for me. I'm grateful that it worked out well for me, but there's no guarantee that it'll work, that, that you won't have a riot on your hands if you try to implement this kind of lesson. But we did implement the lesson, and that feeling of this is unfair was really strong. And my message to my students at that time was, yes, it is. It's really unfair. It really is. You have to take what you're given and do your best with it. And then we moved on from there. Here, we moved on from there from 2 Corinthians 8. And here I just want to read quickly. And now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that God has given to the Macedonian churches in the midst of a very severe trial. Their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. So here Paul is telling the Christians at Corinth that the Macedonians had been saving up, and that they gave a great deal of money to Paul to take back to Jerusalem. And Paul is now writing to the Corinthians, and because he knows that the Corinthians have had a couple of false starts trying to get started on their collection for Jerusalem. And he's saying, now look, I want you to see what's happening with the Macedonians. And then skipping down to verse 10, and here's my judgment about what is best for you in this matter. Last year, you were the first not only to give, but also to have the desire to do so. Now finish the work, so that your eager willingness to do it may be matched by your completion of it, according to your means. For if the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not to what one does not have. And then he goes on to talk about equality. And this is something I want to talk about here in just a minute. Our desire is not that others might be relieved while you are hard pressed, but that there might be equality. At the present time, your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn their plenty will supply what you need. The goal is equality. As it is written, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Now, the reference Paul is making to here is to the gathering of manna, where those who went out and gathered the manna prior to the Sabbath, that they went and they gathered as much as they could. But in the gathering of the manna, they took and they put it away. And in the morning, God had equalized the amount such that every household had it as much as they needed. Now, the point there is that the households were not of all the same size. Some of them had 2 or 3 people. Some of them had 20 or 40 or 50 people in a household. Well, God was able to make the supply equal to their need. And here, what he's saying to the Macedonians and to the Corinthians is, he's saying that your giving should be proportional to your income. It should be according to what you have, not to what you don't have. It should be proportional, and that there ought to be proportional equality between you and the Macedonians. And here, earlier on, he points out that the Macedonians gave quite a bit, even though they're quite poor. And you Corinthians are actually quite rich in comparison. But we're looking for a kind of equality here. And he's not saying, the Macedonians gave X number of dollars and we think you should match it. These are not matching funds. He's saying they gave proportionally, you should give proportionally. That the sacrifice ought to be equal. Matthew 25, starting in verse 31, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." And you know the rest of the story. The righteous say, "When did we ever see you in these conditions, Lord?" And the Lord said, "Well, inasmuch as you've done this to the least of these little ones, you've done it unto me." And then to the goats, he says, "You didn't do these things. Be gone with you." And they said, "Well, when did we see you in this condition?" He said, "Well, inasmuch as you failed to do it to the least of these little ones, you failed to do it to me." Here's my point, or at least part of the point, is that God doesn't call on us to wipe out world hunger. He doesn't call on us to eliminate poverty. Jesus promises that there'll be poverty always. What he calls on us to do is to give in accord with what we have, to give according to our means. And he says things are unfair, things are unequal, there are rich and poor. He says, what I'm asking you to do is to give what you have. He doesn't ask us to give the impossible. He asks us to give the possible. He asks us to make things as good as we can make them. And within the church, he doesn't say, now, in the first century, we see that the church, in their zeal to give, that they all kind of quit their jobs, sell all their property, give all the money to the apostles, and then live on daily distributions. That model for church giving gets supplanted by Paul's model. Paul's model was keep your jobs, keep your homes, keep working, keep giving, be living sacrifices, give week after week, and then we'll help those who don't have from what we give week after week. And they spent a lot of money bailing out their Jerusalem church, which by this time was bankrupt, partly because of the Roman oppression, but partly because of the fact that their initial model, this initial communal model, was an utter failure. And that church was completely impoverished by their own model of giving, where they tried to make everything equal. Equality of outcomes never works. It's only equitable equality that works. You give out of what you have, not out of what you don't have. And this can be applied in the world, but it certainly can be applied in the church. God has given to us generously. One thing that we can certainly say is that even though we're all unequal in the kingdom, we all have more now than we had when we entered the kingdom. And one of the things that we have in measure, although we don't have it in equal measure, one of the things that we have in measure is grace. We're called upon to be ministers of grace one to another. Minister of the manifold grace of God in all of its forms, in all of its grace effects. And this we do. And I just want to encourage you today, as we're in this season of giving, which is a season that for Christians is barely a wax as opposed to a wane. Christian giving seems to be a constant year round. But at this time of year, the world tries to make you feel guilty for being one of the haves rather than being one of the have-nots. Well, there's no reason to feel guilty for having what you have. Be a good steward of what you have. Give according to what you have. And you can't correct all of the inequalities in the world, but you can alleviate some of them. And that's not just good enough. That's good. By God's definition. That's good. And that's my lesson for today.